Hey everyone, and welcome to this creative workshop. And in this session, we're going to be going over the warp stabilization tool in Adobe Premiere. Now, the warp stabilization tool is the perfect tool if you've got footage that is just too shaky and needs some minor correction. Or perhaps you wanted to create a static shot, but didn't have a tripod handy at the time, and this effect can stabilize that footage and make it look static as well. Warp Stabilizer is an incredibly easy tool to apply, but you should be aware it does have some limitations, so where possible you should always try to get it right in camera. So let's apply the Warp Stabilization tool to this clip here. Now this clip is available from pexels.com, where they've got lots and lots of videos of sheep as well as other things like chickens, pigs, dogs, and actually anything you want. Let's type in skating. Let's have a search for skating. There we go, a load of other footage that you can download and use in your projects and practice your editing skills as well. The clip that I'm using, I'll put a link below to the original footage, but also I'm going to upload it to my Google Drive so you can download it in case the link becomes inactive. So back to Premiere, and I've got this footage of this girl who's terrorizing all these sheep. And actually, I quite like how the camera moves in this. I don't have a problem with how wobbly it is in this really, but for the purposes of this exercise, let's stabilize it. So over in the effects window, you can see I've already searched for it here. I've typed the word warp in, and you should find the warp stabilizer. And the warp stabilizer, all you do is you drag it onto the clip, and it will start to analyze in the background while you're working on other bits and pieces, the clip. Now, this process will take longer depending on several different factors of your computer. However, once complete, it will say stabilizing, and then the process is complete. Now, let's have a look at some of these options that we have in Warp Stabilizer. So first of all, the result. So smooth motion. So originally the camera was a little bit jerky, and now we've got smooth motion applied. You can see that the camera movement is a lot smoother. And this can be adjusted through the smoothness here. So if I was to take this down to 0, I can see the original camera motion is back. So 0 is no smoothness at all, and it's like the original. And then if I was to take this up to 100, or any value even higher, it will increase the smoothness, so the camera looks a lot more floaty here. So the higher the value, the more smoothness that gets added to the clip. I'm going to take this back down to the original of 50%. And you'll notice each time it says stabilizing, but it's not having to analyze the clip. It's just merely applying a different stabilization, so it's a lot quicker. Now in the result here, I've got smooth motion, but I could choose no motion. Now no motion will attempt to hold the camera still. Now in this shot, there's a bit of movement from the top to the bottom at the beginning of the shot. So you're going to see some movement in this, but as the camera holds position, you'll notice that it will create no motion at all. And here you can see it looks like the shot is being filmed on a tripod. No motion's fantastic, but it does have its limitations. For instance, if you're doing a running shot or you're filming in a moving car, there's no way that you could apply no motion to this effect. I'm going to take it back to smooth motion. Now I'm going to look at the method, and that's the method of tracking that's being used. Now each time I change these, you'll notice it will say stabilizing, but it's not analyzing the clip again. It's just merely applying the stabilization to the analysis, so it's a much quicker process. Now these go from top to bottom, being the most simplest method of tracking to the most complex method of tracking. The most complex being the subspace warp, and that is the one that you'll probably use most of the time. Let's choose position. So position will just move the footage to try and stabilize the footage. And here you can see that there's some wobble, unnaturally looking wobble, being added to the clip. Next, we'll try position, scale and rotation. So now using these three values, it's going to try to move the footage again to stabilize it. And it is looking better this time. Then we have perspective. Perspective is a type of stabilization where the entire frame is effectively corner pinned. And finally, the default subspace warp. This attempts to warp various parts of the frame differently to stabilize the entire picture. And most of the time, this will give the best results, but it may not always work. So when you're applying the method, if subspace warp isn't giving you the best results, you should then go down to perspective, then you should go down to position, scale and rotation, and then you should go down to position, basically working from the most complex form to the simplest form. Another important option here is the framing of the border. Now currently it's set to stabilize, crop and auto scale. Again, this is another default that you will use 95% of the time. However, let's go through these. So stabilize only. And you can see that stabilize only is keeping the footage still and stabilized, but it's not scaling up the footage. So we get these black borders introduced. And depending on how much movement is in the clip will depend on how big these black borders are. Stabilize and crop. This introduces a much more uniformed crop around the whole picture. And actually this is very usable, especially if you're going to take something like 4K footage down to 1080p, you might decide to use this option. Stabilize, crop and auto scale, which is the default. So this applies the crop that we just saw a minute ago, and then it scales up the picture. Depending on how large the crop is will depend on how big the scale is. And obviously once you start scaling over something like 10%, you might start seeing some degradation in the actual footage quality. But here it looks great still. And finally, stabilize and synthesize edges. Now this is interesting because what this tries to do is it tries to apply the crop without scaling it, but actually build the edges of the frame based on the frames before and after the actual frame it's trying to build. Now this might take a bit more processing power, so sometimes you might have to render the file. However, once completed, you can see it's trying to fill in the border. Personally, I have never had a really good result from this, and I often see that there is some artifacts in it that just make it look unrealistic and probably not suitable for a client. So I'm going to place this back to stabilize, crop and auto scale. Now let's have a look at some of the advanced features down here. So first of all, you have detailed analysis. Now, if you wanted to improve the quality of the stabilization, you can add detailed analysis. I haven't found it have much impact on what I've used before, but if you're really struggling, it's worth pressing this button just to see if it can analyze your footage better. The other option which is worth looking at down here is crop less and smooth more. Now, this reduces the smoothing that the warp stabilizer will attempt to put on the clip. And while it will result in a slightly more shaky shot, I find that my shots often don't need too much smoothing. This often cuts out a lot of the distortion and jello effect. You could try reducing this down in 5% increments. So for example, here I've got it at 50%. And if I was to take this all the way down to 5%, that still looks fairly nice. So I'm actually keeping some of the quality of the original image there. And also there's the hide warning banner. The hide warning banner is quite a useful feature. That'll basically pop up if ever your footage needs analyzing again or something's wrong with the way that the effect's been applied. So I always suggest that you leave this on. Now finally, I'm going to give you one last tip. If your computer is struggling to play the timeline because of all the effects on it and the warp stabilizer and everything like that. You can reduce the quality of it here to half, quarter, eighth quality, but actually a more interesting button is the global FX mute. Now this can be added by going to the plus symbol here and simply dragging it onto the buttons here and then just clicking OK, and that will apply it. And what this does is I can mute all the effects on my timeline. So now I can see the original footage and I could come along and edit as much as I wanted to. And then as soon as I want to apply it again, I just click the FX and that will apply it for the whole timeline. It's just important that you remember to turn this back on before you export your video. And actually, there is one other incident which might be a problem, is that if you decided to apply warp stabilizer to a clip that has had any speed manipulation added to it. So for instance, if I move the warp stabilizer now, and let's speed this clip up to 200%, and then I add the warp stabilizer, I actually get the warning banner pop up. Now, warp stabilizer can't be used on speed effects. However, if I am to now nest this clip by right clicking on it and nesting it inside its own sequence, I can now add the warp stabilizer, and again it'll analyze it and then I can apply it in the same ways. And there we have it, the clip's been sped up, but warp stabilizer has been added to it. So when does warp stabilizer struggle the most? Well, it often struggles when a clip has complex movement in it, perhaps 2 or 3 different camera movements in it. And then it can add what's called the jello effect, where it all looks all wobbly like a jelly. So here's a clip of the sheep terrorizer, and the camera's going from behind a following shot to then panning around the person. Now, warp stabilizer typically has issues with such complex camera movements. So if I apply warp stabilizer to this clip, and now we can see a lot of wobbling happening up here, and it looks kind of weird and jelly-like and artificial, which is something that stylistically I wouldn't want in a shot. I have seen some videos where people have said it was the look they were going for. I personally don't understand that, but potentially it could be used. However, if you are having trouble with this, one of the best things to do is then just to reduce the smoothness, or adjust the crop less and smooth more options as well. So those will help somewhat. It might not get perfect. For instance, if I take smoothness down to say 10%, it's still going to be wobbly, but it still looks artificial here. I could reduce it further, but some of the shot looks usable as well. However, that's not personally something that I would recommend. So I personally feel that there are some limitations to just how much you can apply warp stabilizer to, and I've seen plenty of examples of people putting it in films and it just looking artificial. So that's an introduction to the warp stabilizer. I hope you found it useful, and subscribe to the Creative Workshop for more tips on creative software and techniques. Thanks for watching.